Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are about to pull up our slides and get started. I'm really grateful that all of you have decided to take a few minutes out of your Monday evening and join us. We will go on for about an hour, but if you have to leave early because you're registered for this, you will receive a recording after the fact. So thank you for joining us, and I am going to jump into our slides. And before I do that, my colleague Bridget is going to share in the chat a link to our annual report, which is what we'll largely be discussing this evening. And so you're welcome to follow along or just save it for some bedtime reading later if you're so inclined. Okay, we'll get started. So, hi everyone. Thank you again for coming tonight. My name is Grace Hanna, and I'm the Executive Director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And I am here with my colleague Bridget Maloney tonight to discuss We the People, Floridian for Alternatives to the Death Penalty's year in review and the road ahead. So, as many of you know, last year in Florida, we had a pretty remarkable pace of executions with 19 individuals being executed. And we remain with the second largest death row in the country, currently at 251 people. So, we're going to share a bit about the events that led to last year, what we're expecting for 2026, and how we can have help from all of you. Before we jump into that, I want to share that FADP is a Florida-based, obviously, statewide organization that is working to end the death penalty in Florida. We do that through advocacy, both opposing executions and preventing new death sentences. We work with the legislature to prevent the expansion of the death penalty. We also provide support to the families of people on death row and the families of victims of violent crime. We believe in an empowerment-oriented approach, working with individuals most directly impacted by the death penalty in the criminal legal system. And we also work to, in everything we do, center the humanity of the people involved. And like I shared, I'm Grace Hanna. I'm the executive director of FADP. I'm a social worker by training, and I'm based in Tallahassee. I took this role in November after having been an organizer at FADP for several months and a board member from before that. And my colleague Bridget Maloney will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bridget Maloney. I am the communications director for FADP. I've been with the organization for almost 5 years now, and I'm just really grateful that you all are here with us tonight.
Thanks, Bridget. Before we get started, I think it's really important to share that every execution does begin with a violent crime. And this is something that I know as the family member of a murder victim myself, and as someone who frequently speaks to people who have had loved ones be executed. I feel like we really can't say enough that these are the most directly impacted families. And while we oppose the death penalty, nothing we do or say is ever meant to diminish from the tragedy that was felt by these families. And I acknowledge that in many cases, they have been led to believe or been told that an execution will give them peace and the sense of closure that they need. And I often say, I hope that that's true for them, because I have come to believe that the system doesn't provide that. But ultimately, what I want is them to have the peace that they need at the end of the day.
So often we talk about what makes Florida so unique, other than the fact that we executed more people than any other state last year. It's not just the fact that we execute people more frequently than other states. We have a very unique scheme from the time that trial starts and determining when to seek death in cases, all the way through execution and even after. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the parts that make up our death penalty system and what make it so unique and also dangerous. So what we have on the left is our non-unanimous sentencing scheme, starting at when a prosecutor is seeking death and when someone is sentenced to death. We have the lowest threshold in the entire country for imposing that sentence. So only 8 out of 4 jurors need to agree to sentence someone to death. Just 10 years ago, the US Supreme Court found Florida's non-unanimous sentencing scheme unconstitutional, and that threw the state into a flurry of hundreds of resentencings. Those are still ongoing. We had a period of time that was unanimous sentencing, and now we are back to nearly the same scheme that was struck down. So people are actually were granted resentencings because of the non-unanimous jury issue are now being sentenced again under a non-unanimous sentencing scheme. And this came in the wake of the horrific Parkland shooting, and the defendant in that case receiving a life sentence by a 9-3 jury vote. And so one other state, Alabama, allows for non-unanimous jury recommendations, and they allow it at a 10-2 vote. And our executive authority. So our state is incredibly unique in that our governor has sole and pretty much unfettered authority to determine when someone has exhausted their appeals, of course, who to sign a death warrant for, when to set the execution for, whether to do it at all. So there is no law that is mandating that he sign death warrants or set execution dates. It's completely within his discretion. And that is incredibly unique because what it means is that, at the words of the governor and the attorney general, the people on death row are read their death warrant and are basically given 30 days, them and their legal team and victims' family members and their family members have about 30 days. And they don't know when that's going to happen. In terms of our clemency structure, so we have seen, particularly last year, that clemency absolutely can and does save lives. And many states have a real opportunity to advocate for clemency. And clemency in Florida would be commuting the sentence to life without parole. That is the alternative sentence that we have in Florida. So once someone on the row has completed all of their appeals, they get scheduled for a clemency interview, and they are assigned a new lawyer specifically for clemency. The clemency board is made up of our governor, our attorney general, who is responsible for defending the warrant in the courts, our CFO, who was the lead sponsor on both of our death penalty expansion bills in 2023, and our agricultural commissioner, which means that it is nearly impossible at that stage to get a 3-1 vote for clemency. And on the right, it is our also unique lethal injection protocol. Florida's history of botched executions dating back to electric chair. We have had to change our protocol quite a few times, and that is not to say that it is working now, but we are the only state to have a 3-drug lethal injection protocol, and it consists of a sedative, a paralytic, and a drug that is purportedly to induce cardiac arrest. And the paralytic makes it so that really no one can actually see what's going on with the person, and sort of makes it look like a more clean or natural process. But really it's an incredibly painful procedure that we are kind of shielding the public from by using that paralytic. Our record exonerations, I've heard legislators and others talk about how the fact that we have 30 death row exonerees is a testament to our system, that we're getting it right when we're letting them out of prison. We have had 30 people exonerated in our state since the death penalty was reinstated in the 70s. Our most recent exoneration was in 2020 for more than 30 years on the row. I think we've had about 5 in the last 15 years or so. And I think that's incredibly important because it nobody wants to spend over 30 years on death row fighting their innocence to only be released and not compensated. It is extremely concerning that with 30 people, and we executed 19 last year, we are really bad at getting the right person, and we are really bad at rectifying that when we know that we have. And on top of that, the vast majority of those exonerees had non-unanimous jury votes. So that is one thing that our exonerees have in common, is not even DNA testing or normal things like that. It's they were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which is obviously concerning as we return to that. And secrecy. So in 2022, many states were having or have had difficulty getting lethal injection drugs. And in an attempt to shield identities and protect purportedly DOC staff members, the entire lethal injection process, where we get drugs, how they are used, is completely shrouded in secrecy. It is nearly impossible to get any sort of records, which is in complete contrast to Florida's open record laws. That is actually one of the things the state does very well, is public records requests and open, transparent government. And it begs the question of what exactly they have to hide regarding here, and whether it actually is about protecting members of DOC, and if so, from what.
Thanks, Bridget. I am going to speak a little bit about Florida's current death row and how it has changed over time and why it has changed over time. And as I said earlier, Florida has the second largest death row in the country. The largest belongs to California, where they notably have not carried out any executions in quite a few years. And some of our colleagues are doing heroic work there on a universal clemency campaign. I think any conversation about the death penalty has to begin with a conversation about race. And I say that with the understanding that the way that Florida reports on individuals on death row and on population demographics in general is a bit confusing. They group white and Hispanic and Latino individuals together, and any other groups are just other. So we don't have particularly granular data, but what we do know is that Black people are wildly overrepresented on death row. So about 15% of Florida's population is Black, and nearly 35% of Florida's death row population is Black. We did not address it here in this graph, but it is also worth saying that the vast majority of people on death row are there for killing white people, regardless of their race. It is relatively uncommon to be sentenced to death if you are a white person. Actually, it's very uncommon to be sentenced to death if you are a white person who killed a person of color. And it is fairly uncommon to be sentenced to death if you are a person of color who has killed a person of color. And though we're not going to discuss it tonight, it is in our year-end report. We talk a bit about the retaliatory nature of some of the warrants that we saw this year that were particularly related to legal teams, highlighting the discriminatory nature of Florida's warrant selection process. So if you'll bear with me for this graphic, it represents, we have the 251 people who are currently on death row. And well, as of New Year's Eve, actually. So we have all of these individuals, and we have the 5 people who received new death sentences in 2025. And we have 5 individuals who were resentenced to death. And so that means that their sentences were vacated. Actually, all of their sentences were vacated because they were sentenced under the previous non-unanimous statute. And when the Supreme Court overturned that, they had to go back for resentencing. But now that the Florida legislature has reinstated non-unanimity, they were all resentenced non-unanimously once again, leaving the possibility that when the US Supreme Court, again says, really, we meant it, you have to have a unanimous death sentence, that all of these individuals will have to go back for resentencing once again. Today, the Death Penalty Information Center and Tracking Florida's Death Penalty, which is a Substack blog run by Melanie Colmanson, published a joint report on these resentencings on the anniversary of Hearst v. Florida. I really encourage everyone to check it out. There are also 21 individuals who are pending resentencing. Most of these are, again, those Hearst cases who had non-unanimous death sentences and are um, now facing, again, non-unanimous resentencing. But some of them have evidentiary issues or penalty phase issues. In 2025, we also lost 25 people off of death row. So there were those who were executed, and there were also 6 individuals who died of natural causes or of non-execution deaths. And lest we forget that there are also people who were resentenced to a life without parole sentence, and people where the state sought death, but a jury recommended a life without parole sentence. And something that we are often asked about at FADP is why, isn't life without parole just as bad? And my answer to that is always that we are a death penalty organization and we would like to abolish the death penalty. While I certainly have strong feelings on life without parole and the, indignity of taking away someone's hope of ever being released from prison, currently in Florida, it is the only statutory alternative. There is not another sentence available for first-degree murder. And I think it's really important to note that just because we are arguing to end the death penalty, that means that we're defaulting on what is currently the statute. That doesn't necessarily mean that we love it or support it, but it is the law right now. And we believe that ending the death penalty is the first step towards changing harsh sentences in general. So in 2025, we had what was truly a unparalleled record-breaking year in executions. And I'm going to share a little bit about that. And then Bridget is going to break down a bit more about these kind of categories of individuals who were executed. But I think we should first begin by saying that America is broadly moving away from the death penalty. There's a record low percentage of Americans who support the death penalty right now, and 47% of Americans don't believe that the death penalty is applied fairly. And when asked if they preferred a sentence of life imprisonment or the death penalty for first-degree murder, 60% of Americans said that they preferred a sentence of life imprisonment. So despite the rush to execute this year and so much of the political chatter about how this is what Americans want or this is what Floridians want, what we've seen in the data is that that's not really true. Florida, however, is moving in the opposite direction. In Florida in 2025, we had 19 executions, and that makes up about 40% of the 47 executions that occurred around the country last year. The Death Penalty Information Center published their annual report, and the thesis of it was if not for Florida, executions would have been on the decline around the country this year. So Florida stood out not in a good way, but I think, and we're going to continue to talk about how I don't think all hope is lost. So, go ahead, Bridget. Sorry.
Well, I thank Grace for bringing that up and for going through these numbers with me 100 times, because it just sort of seems very difficult to imagine that every single case could have not one, not two, but three or so of these very serious issues. So when we talk about the people who are being sentenced to death generally, we are talking about people who are sentenced to death by non-unanimous juries. That is 8 of our 19, 7 veterans. It begs the question of why, how are so many veterans ending up on Florida's death row specifically, let alone death rows across the entire country? 4 people with intellectual disabilities, 2 volunteers for execution, 1 man with an incompetency for execution claim. This is also what happened in 2023. 2 survivors of abuse at state reform schools. It begs the question, and many have researched it and looked into why so many people from reform schools are ending up on Florida's death row. We need to be asking how people are getting here in the first place instead of just what boxes do they check when they're being executed. 4 defendants with questionable access to counsel at the time their warrant was signed, 11 cases with victim survivors in opposition, at least. That's what we know of. And you can tell that this math does not add up to 19 because so many of these issues overlap. So when we talk about who we are executing, yes, we are often talking about people who have done horrific crimes, but we also need to look about how they got there. And people need to know that it's not just happenstance. It's because of conditions that turn someone into something that they never would have and should have been in the first place. So this is our way of not only remembering the 19 people that we executed this year, but their victims. And it also shows just how quickly these executions were happening. We started off with James Ford just 3 days later than an execution scheduled for next month on the 10th. And then less than a month later, we had Eddie James, who I always remember Edward James because he suffered a heart attack while on death row and was literally brought back to life. Michael Tanzi on April 8th, just a few weeks later. Jeffrey Hutchinson, he had an incompetency for execution claim. He was a veteran. Glenn Rogers, Anthony Wainwright. These are real people. And if you just look at the dates and these times in between and think about the legal teams and the families involved, DOC correction officials, Tommy Gudinas in June, Michael Bell in July, Edward Zach also in July. Around this time is when I started to at least feel the pickup of the pace. We had Kyle Bates, Curtis Wyndham, August through September, David Pittman, Victor Jones, Samuel Smithers started off October, Norman Grimm was also in October, Brian Jennings in early November. You can also tell that we are not stopping for any sort of holiday or any sort of break. Richard Randolph, Malik Abdul Shahid, November 20th, Mark Geralds on December 9th, and ending last year with Frank Walls and receiving a warrant for this year less than a month later. We talked about how 7 of our executed men this year were veterans. Some of the most incredible advocacy that I've seen this year are men who have served, who did not end up on death row, standing up for their fellow servicemen. And it got to the point where we would have to ask, is this person also a veteran? Because there are just so many. And this is one of our favorite quotes from a sign-on letter that was delivered to Ron DeSantis from nearly 200 veterans, not abolitionists, not necessarily people who would always be in these spaces and always be against the death penalty, but recognizing that these are people who served our country and served it honorably and returned and committed horrific crimes and are willing to be brave and stand up and recognize that the sheer number of them forces us to step back and ask, why are so many veterans in Florida ending up on death row and then being executed? And these are just, a few of the pictures that we are lucky enough to have of some of our advocacy efforts, as well as actually being able to see that these are people who served our country admirably, and we did not effectively offer them treatment when they returned. Intellectual disability, we talked about 4 people with very strong intellectual disability claims. It is against the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent, if whatever that matters, if not just human dignity, to execute somebody who is intellectually disabled. And we did it not once, not twice, not 3 times. And I wanted to include this quote from Hall versus Florida, not only because it's a Florida case, again, at our highest court, discussing how we apply the death penalty, but that the 8th Amendment's protection of dignity reflects the nation we have been, the nation we are, and the nation we aspire to be. It is fundamentally, legally, and morally wrong to execute people with intellectual disability, and the fact that we did it even once is a stain on our state's history. volunteers. We had two volunteers this year. These were people who, when the guards came and read their death warrant, regardless of what claims they had filed in their history of appeals, they dropped them. Particularly Mark, after 17 of his people were taken, and Mark had very strong claims. He was a fighter, and he decided that he no longer wanted to fight. It is a type of autonomy, but it's quite dreadful to think that someone would be so despondent and so recognizing that the system is piled against them, that even strong claims were not going to be heard. This is one of my favorite quotes because it's so powerful, that all year Mark watched, and Norman too, watched their neighbors all the way with real claims. Like, not that these are not real, but it's like claims that should have stopped their execution and didn't. And I always say that I have a difficult time with volunteers, but if that's the kind of ownership that someone can take over their life, their last days of their life in that time, we still advocate for them because we believe the death penalty is always wrong, even when somebody wants it, particularly because there are so many mental health issues beyond that. But I can't blame someone for wanting to feel a bit of autonomy in a situation where you have absolutely none. And I will pass it over to my wonderful executive director.
Thanks, Bridget. Something we spoke about a bit earlier is this phenomenon of state abuse survivors who are on Florida death row. And, ultimately, there was an investigation by the Marshall Project that found it was somewhere north of 50 individuals who were once students at either Florida's Dozier School for Boys or Florida's Okeechobee School for Boys, eventually ended up on Florida death row. And those are phenomenal numbers. Dozier and Okeechobee were state-run reform schools that students were often sent to as an alternative to juvenile detention. They were often sent for very petty crimes like truancy or perhaps shoplifting or, whistling at a woman across the street. And these schools were horribly abusive. The students there were beat, they were sexually abused, they were forced to work, they were leased out to individuals in their town as labor. And for many years, Florida denied that this happened on the campuses of their schools. They said that they were lying and said, we rehabilitated you. You are a successful adult because of us. And due to some really tireless advocacy by a group of survivors called the White House Boys, Florida eventually agreed to allow the excavation of part of the Dozier School campus. And what they found there was not at all surprising to the survivors, but was pretty shocking to many, which was a site of about 50 graves. And these were young children who had been students there who died under, various circumstances and were buried in unmarked graves on the campus of the school. The part of it that always, lives in my mind is that one of them was found shackled. There were still shackles on his bones. And Florida began this kind of reckoning process after this discovery and ultimately passed a bill to compensate a subgroup of survivors of the Dozier School. And there were quite a few of those who were eligible for compensation on Florida death row, some of whom have received the money, but one who did received his money, and then 72 days later, the governor signed his death warrant. He kind of jokingly said, well, I don't even get to spend the money. What a ripoff, right? But it's always been remarkable to me that the state of Florida literally paid reparations for the harm that was done to these students and then turned around and killed them. So I'm going to chat a bit about just what we do as FADP, kind of putting on my programming hat, um, and what we can do in a system that is designed to kill people as efficiently as possible. Often what many of you know us for is opposing executions, and I think that we do that in a visible and vocal way. For each execution, we create petitions, we send letters to the governor, we show up both at Florida State Prison where the execution occurs and around the state at different vigils. If you go to our website, you can find a vigil near you, as well as vigils online with our partners at Death Penalty Action. I think that this is one of the most important things we do because it shows our state leaders that people do care enough to show up and oppose this. We also work really closely with the legal teams to ensure that our messaging about each execution is aligned with their legal filings and to support, them in those efforts. We also do quite a bit of legislative advocacy. I am based in Tallahassee, where the state capitol is. Our legislative session actually starts tomorrow morning. And we're certainly monitoring for any bills that might come up related to the death penalty. Last year in 2025, there were 5 bills related to death penalty expansion. And across those, our supporters sent over 30,000 letters to members of the Florida legislature. We also appeared in 12 committees giving testimony, expert and citizen testimony on these bills. And something that FADP does, I think we do really well, is issuing statements that can guide media response and also guide public response and help people, understand what the impact of each bill is. And two that we were really proud of this year was, related to a bill that was passed during the special session last January that called for a mandatory death penalty for quote unauthorized aliens. And there are many constitutional issues with this, but it was almost slipped in under the radar. And because of FADP supporters, we were able to oppose that bill and soften the language. I think it is certainly still constitutionally problematic, and we oppose it, in every form, but you all showed up and were able to earn some concessions. Another one that I thought was just really remarkable is that Florida passed a bill that authorized several new capital crimes last year, including one that would authorize the death penalty in certain cases of child sex trafficking. And that is a horrible crime. And nothing I do or say can minimize the awfulness of that crime. But I also cannot take away the fact that literally weeks after this occurred literally weeks after the execution of a man who himself was a survivor of childhood sexual trafficking. So we had the legislators saying that their highest calling was to protect children and to stop these crimes from ever happening again. And we killed one of the victims. We also do media coordination at FADP. We field many media requests every day and speak to them. We direct them to our partners and provide quotes. We also are able to pitch stories and work behind the scenes. And I think that that's something that we do to keep executions in the public eye rather than allowing it to kind of, happen in secret, because that is something the state would like to happen. Florida State Prison, if you have never been, is on an isolated road in the middle of nowhere. It's about, an hour west of Jacksonville and an hour north of Gainesville, and is not an easy place to find or reach, and that is by design. So by ensuring that this makes it into the public consciousness, I think we're preventing that secrecy. We also provide public education, whether that is being invited to speak to law students or church groups or in community settings or even in academic settings. I think that's something that we have found to be really useful and meaningful. Anytime FADP has the chance to show up and teach the public about the death penalty, we make an effort to do it. These next two, I have to be a little bit more careful when I talk about because they're just so um, inherently sensitive to each case. But we do quite a bit of casework and work around clemency here at FADP. And so that, occurs after someone has exhausted their appeals and they're up for a clemency hearing, or perhaps if they are having a specific issue that we can help often with, often what we do is help them find the person who can help them. But we're always glad to do that. And I'm a social worker by training, so some of this is kind of my favorite thing to do, but it's been a really rewarding part of the work for me. And finally, victim advocacy. Like I said, I'm a murder victim family member myself, and while every experience is different, I know that the pain that these individuals are experiencing is really significant. And something I have found just so meaningful in this work is working with victims, some of whom actually support the death penalty, and sitting with them and hearing them out and offering them some information and knowledge because, as much as the state says that they are doing this to support the victims, they often don't actually, receive the education or the information that they need. More than once, I have been with a victim who has asked me, how does the state carry out executions? Am I going to watch an electrocution? And Florida hasn't used the electric chair in quite a while, but, these are the things that the state is not telling these people. We also do a fair bit of organizing work, and that looks like press releases and gathering individuals who are murder victims' family members or former members of law enforcement. We've also hosted several press conferences this year with faith leaders opposed to the death penalty and veterans opposed to the death penalty. And again, much of that work happens out of the spotlight, but I think is incredibly important. And finally, this is a cause that is really near to my heart is the Stephen Booker Trust. And kind of my first job at FADP actually was assisting with this project. And Stephen Booker was a man who died unexpectedly on Florida death row in 2023, which was actually a year when we had 6 executions, and then we had one in 2024, and then 19 this year. But Stephen Booker, unbeknownst to anyone, many had inherited quite a bit of money from a relative. And that was very uncommon. That's very uncommon on any death row, but that was basically unheard of. And he really thoughtfully left some money behind to different groups. Actually, I feel like I've just this week learned of something else really wonderful and kind he did with his money that I didn't know about before. But he left some with the clause that it only be used to support the families of people facing execution. And so with that money, we have been able to bring families to Florida for their final visits with their loved one prior to an execution. We have been able to pay for something as simple as stamps so that someone can send, their father photos of their children before they're executed. We have paid for pet sitting so that people could come to the vigil for their loved one. We are really able to walk with these people in what is a dark and scary and very public facing moment. I think when you have a loved one being executed, you're immediately, thrust into the spotlight, and often they have reporters calling them and seeking them out and being able to have a little bit of a financial cushion to help them navigate that period of time. Even things like paying for cremation and an urn. This is an unexpected cost because like we said, the governor has the sole authority to sign a warrant. No one knows when it's coming. And anything we can do to kind of ease some of that burden, I think is really meaningful and important. I'm going to pass back to Bridget to talk a little bit about 2026 and what we think will be coming ahead.
Yes, and spoiler alert, it is actually not all bad news. Um, so these are just a few of the things. I love this job, this terrible, hard job. But mostly I love how long I've been with FADP because no matter what happens in a year, and 2025 certainly tested that. But 2023 did as well, and 2024 did as well. We had Lauren Cole in 2024, and it was horrific. And so I have seen us go from a place where we weren't executing anyone to we were executing 6 people to we were executing one to 19. And what has been consistent in that is our growth, and not just people on a list who are going to open an email. I mean, number of people at vigils across the state, number of signatures, and not tiring out. And in a system where people really recognize that it nearly impossible to stop one of these executions, and recognizing the odds against us, but still seeing that we are building something so powerful. And I can say that I promise that on this side, seeing engagement on social media, talking to people out in, I go to law school in New York, getting calls from reporters who are legitimately interested in opposing the death penalty. It's been phenomenal to see. So public opposition is growing. It's growing everywhere. It's growing here in Florida. Advocacy, we are going to be asking more of you, in between executions, through executions, if we see many or one or however many, not just during crisis. And we want everyone to sort of feel that there's power just under, not just under the threat of somebody dying in 30 days. And we did a lot of that in the short amount of time that we had between Frank and the upcoming execution next month that we will talk about a little bit. More executions are likely. I would be lying to everyone and myself if I didn't believe that were true. But I will share that my very first execution at FADP, I started with the baseline of maybe we can't stop this, but we're going to do everything that we possibly can in the next 30 days to show that we believe that we can stop this, and one day it's going to work. And I fully believe that. It's an election year, so whether or not we hear the truth from some people, I think that there will be extra pressure on anyone running. We will eventually have a new governor, and I've some of you have heard me say before that as much as I would like to place a lot of blame on a person, it is the fact that position is given so much authority, with no guardrails. And so we desperately want to make sure that whoever is in that position knows that responsibility. Increased media attention to systemic failures. So like Grace said, we are good storytellers, and it's starting to pick up more of just not just the grievous word cases themselves, but sort of the entire system and how we got here in the first place, and how we can actually fix it, which isn't going to be with 27 more executions. Our first execution of the year is scheduled 3 days earlier than last year. That's just a note on pace. I can't predict. I wish that I could, but I cannot predict when and if another warrant will be signed. Increased focus on transparency and access to information. For anybody to have an opinion, legislators or any of us to have an opinion, whether it is for or against the death penalty, you have to have the information. And we have some of it, but we don't have all of it. And if Florida wants to continue to have this system, they're going to have to be some sort of transparency surrounding it. Deeper support for victims, families, impacted communities, and people on death row, recognizing that the time between a warrant and an execution is not the only time and after to be there for these people. And exactly what Grace said, making sure that we are reaching out to victims who are for the death penalty, for the fact that in 6 months after that execution, they're not going to hear from the state about how are you doing, but we will always be here as a resource, regardless of how they feel. And like Grace said, connecting them to places that can help. And did I mention, the thousands more supporters that we have, that we did this time last year and the year before. And I think did I get everything? And no bad bills, ... yet. We have been monitoring, and like Grace said, session starts tomorrow. It's often hard for me to imagine what they could possibly come up with, but I am sure that they can come up with something. So while we don't have anything that's ringing alarm bells now, the wonderful Grace was there when we in the same day introduced a bill expanding execution methods to anything not constitutional, and that she was there in about 20 minutes. So it might be, that fast. I'm laughing because she managed to get there in 20 minutes, and people managed to advocate in 20 minutes, and we actually stopped the bill for a second. So there's a lot to look forward to. There's a lot to be tired and sort of nervous about. But we're still standing, and there's Grace and I and all of you and Maria, who's our legal and policy director. And, people are paying attention. They're still paying attention from what happened last year. And then they're getting to know about what happened in those years before. And for whatever it's worth, that being very much in people's faces is really, really important. And the fact that it's happening so early this year really gives us an opportunity to start really strong and show that we're tired from last year, but we've not given up.
Thanks. And then we'll answer a few questions. But to wrap us up, I really want to encourage you all, if you are not following us on social media, to please take a few moments and do that. We post things there. We also send out our emails. If you're not receiving those, you can go to fadp.org and click join us. And this part is always uncomfortable for me, but in the spirit of doing hard things, I think that we need your support to do this work. And that support means showing up and signing petitions and sending letters and coming and testifying in front of the legislature. And it also means when you're able to offer financial support, we greatly appreciate it. We use it for advocacy efforts across the state, and we seek to uplift every story of every person who's impacted by the death penalty, and particularly by executions. And I, as the executive director, am always excited and happy to speak to people about the work that we do. I am pretty easy to reach at info@fadp.org, and welcome the opportunity to speak with any of you about what we do and how you can help. So with that, I'm going to close out of the screen, and we're going to answer just a few questions that we have received. Okay, and Bridget, I know we got quite a few emailed, and I also see two that were sent in the chat, and I can answer those, and then maybe you can address the emailed ones.
Perfect. Yeah.
Cool. So the first question is, I've noticed Ohio seems to have a lot of executions scheduled this year. Will it go ahead? So that is a really interesting kind of point to look at how Ohio and Florida are different. So Ohio schedules their executions many years out. I believe they actually have executions scheduled until like 2029. None of those will go forward. The governor of Ohio has said that he does not expect to carry out any executions in his term. And I know that there's lots of advocacy around his stance on the death penalty that is going on. So, though those are scheduled, none of them will occur. Unlike in Florida, where we have a 30-day notice. The second question we got was how many doses are left for executions? I've heard 22, and the governor wants to use them all. And, there's no way of us knowing how many doses that they have left. We, have some ideas from different public records requests that have been done and things like that. But I think it is fair to say that Florida, unlike many states, does not seem to have a shortage of lethal injection drugs right now. And then what Florida organizations do we network with? We, work with quite a few different groups across the state. Those include religious groups, those include mental health advocacy groups. I expect that's something that we will be working with quite a bit in the year ahead. The Attorney General has expressed a desire to eliminate or at least severely limit the not guilty by reason of insanity claim. And so I expect that will be something we're working on and working with those folks this year. We also work with other criminal justice focused groups, and um, I'm hesitant to name any here because I think I would leave them out, but there are just so many wonderful partners we work with across the state and actually across the country. And then since the warrant signed for people last year, those were people who had all of their appeals decided. How many people have had their appeals resolved now and are therefore in line for warrants? So this is a two-part question. So we think that people who have had all of their appeals decided might be around 100 of the 251 on the row, but there that does not mean that all of them have been through the clemency process. So the clemency process seems to happen, there's no rhyme or reason to why someone gets picked for clemency. And so it, could happen at any time. So though there are about 100 people who have exhausted their appeals, we don't quite know how many are actually eligible for execution because they've been through clemency, but it's significantly fewer than 100. And then the last question I have before I pass to Bridget to do the email questions is Lauren Cole, I believe, was one of the reform school survivors. Are there currently any survivors of the state schools on death row? Yes, Lauren Cole was one of the reform school survivors. He was executed in 2024. He was the sole execution in 2024. I will note that his death warrant was signed about 48 hours after a newspaper article discussing how Governor DeSantis had not signed any warrants since he had ended his presidential campaign. So, Mr. Cole was kind of at the receiving end of, I believe, the governor's frustration in that scenario. There are currently survivors of the Dozier and Okeechobee schools on the row. I couldn't give you the exact number. I Part of that is also just my wanting to protect those individuals and not give the state a list of people, but there certainly are multiple. It's more than one. Bridget, would you like to address our email questions?
Yes, and those were all great questions. And I will also add that Lauren Cole's warrant was signed very soon, weeks after Governor DeSantis signed the compensation bill into law. So while we talked about Victor, who was compensated, his warrant was signed soon after that legislation. And then Grace, I'll give it back to you for the next question that's in here. So one of our email questions was, it's in the organization's name, alternatives, but what actually are they? And obviously, life without parole is the legal alternative to the death penalty in Florida. But whenever people ask me about the alternatives, I like to think about what is the alternative to them seeking death in the first place? If not, what is the alternative to committing a capital crime? Because when we're talking about sentencing, especially in Florida, it's sort of too late because many people recognize that a natural death in prison for life without parole, where by the way the majority of our first degree murderers are and are serving, is a fate sometimes worse than death. And so when we ask for clemency or we ask for a commutation, we're asking for life without parole not because it's awesome, but because it's going to prevent them from being executed. But these alternatives need to start to, how can we not make a time machine and go back and have Lauren, for example, not be abused at the Dozier school? It's how can we prevent this crime from happening? Because until we can stop, we have no shortage of crime happening in Florida. And obviously, the 19 executions last year did not stop that. And so it is much more interesting to me as to how can we be there in the communities, in the systems in the first place, so that we're not in a situation where someone is faced with, well, when someone is dead or multiple people are dead or harmed in some other way, and now someone is facing two egregious sentences. And I'll call back to our wonderful former executive director, Mark Elliott, who said, stop the killing first, and then sort of deal with the rest. And, in a perfect world for me, if we could just give everyone on the row life without parole today and move forward, that would, save 251 lives. So that was a long-winded way of saying that a lot of what we do and what we're trying to instill in our supporters is how can you be there for the child like Tommy Goodiness, who was in, nearly 100, if not over 100 foster placements. That's where we have to start, because then we're not looking at a dead victim or victims and a dead prisoner. We are looking at life, and we're there way back when. Another question was that the death penalty is enshrined in Florida's Constitution, and what would be the mechanism for changing that for abolition? What needs to take place in order to abolish the death penalty in its entirety in Florida? So historically, there have been about abolishing bills that would just altogether get rid of the statute. Those obviously, did not go anywhere. There is also the possibility of a ballot initiative that would take it completely out of the Constitution. I personally believe that it is more likely that the statute gets struck down in some fashion, and that's the opportunity either legislatively or with a ballot initiative, which I think is also sort of why the rules around ballot initiatives in Florida have changed. At least we have a lot to chip away from now. And so getting rid of those mechanisms and certainly potentially adding in some safeguards, I think is the first step. But my position is that it's likely that there will be a moratorium or some sort of strike down of the statute. That's the opportunity to really get rid of it for good. And what else do I have? Oh, the most effective language to use in pushing back, since Governor DeSantis may want to use all of the 22 remaining doses. Does language matter? Is it a matter of number of people who write? Okay, so I'm always I think that we can be honest in that 19 executions is a lot. And I think that we can say, that it doesn't make us safer. It, I I would love to change Governor DeSantis's mind. I do think that as time goes on, we often get answers to things that are questions like, is this a political reason? And right now, I can't tell you that that's true. In 6 months, if something happens, and someone is running for an office, then come back and perhaps I'll tell you that that was maybe the reason why. But what we like to do and what I think is most effective is pointing out trends. And when you're writing, when the language you're using is sort of what I said before of yes, this person in office now obviously loves the death penalty and wants to execute people. But we granted that power. It's not like he's not, using the power that he had. Like his ability to do this is real. And no matter who is there, it's going to continue to be real. And so I think pointing out the trends of Governor DeSantis was also responsible for the longest moratorium in Florida's history. Our longest time not executing people was under Governor DeSantis. And I leave that to all of you to determine whether or not that was because of COVID-19. It doesn't seem like he would like to say that the state shut down because of COVID-19. And why was there one in 2024? And why did it come 48 hours after, a headline? And I think that takes a bit of the kind of like attacking away, and it's just drawing a line through why are there 7 veterans. You don't have to say, is Governor DeSantis targeting veterans, to say why are 7 of the 19 people we killed veterans. Or you don't have to say that he's targeting Dozier survivors, instead of stepping back and saying, why are there so many Dozier survivors eligible for execution? So I'm not sure if that fully answered the question. He may want to execute 100 million people. But in terms of language mattering, I think that how we move forward and how we continue to make this a really serious issue after Governor DeSantis leaves is to talk about, those trends and that authority. Because if we could spread that authority out a little bit, I mean, we didn't mention it, but the Florida Supreme Court is about to have, all but one not appointed by the governor. And again, yes, it's Governor DeSantis in this case, but that could be any governor. And so I think that's really important. And we do have another one, which is what should people pay attention to in between executions? And that is one of my favorite questions, because there wasn't a lot of time in between them last year, but it is using that time to build strength, to rest, to connect that everything you learned about the person, about the victims, everything you saw in the media, everything you saw from us, into the larger picture of, we're trying to end the death penalty, not just stop executions. And so, taking that time in between to talk to a neighbor, I found that most people that I talk to are horrified regardless of how they feel about the death penalty. And tell other groups that you're in, because this issue, I mean, we've started working with immigration groups because it's also an immigration issue, and we work with sexual abuse survivors because now it's also that issue. It touches 100 different places. And so I think in that in between, or even after signing a petition and stuff like that, go learn more about the Dozier School. Go talk to the wonderful Art Cody about why there are so many veterans on death row. Go read, about Florida's lethal injection procedure, and see what that's about. And sort of, you know, I think that might fill the space in between in a way that isn't just focused on an individual or one case or something like that. I think that's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I if I give people kind of a charge to go out with is that go and tell someone in your life about the death penalty. Pick something about the death penalty that really sticks out to you and, speaks to you or breaks your heart in some way, and use that to go and teach people about the death penalty. That, might be the fact that we have 30 death row exonerees in Florida, more than any other state. It might be that we, only 8 of the 12 jurors are required to sentence someone to death, that it is literally requires more jurors to send someone to jail for stealing a bag of potato chips than it does to sentence them to death. Maybe it's that our death sentences come disproportionately from just a few counties, but pick what sticks out to you and breaks your heart and go and tell someone in your life about it. I think you might be surprised at one, how comfortable it can become, but also how often people will tell you that you've changed their mind or you've made them, think about this for the first time. People don't necessarily have strong feelings about the death penalty, support or opposition. It's more that they do not care. They do not see it and they do not pay attention. And you have to force the people in your life to see it. Because I believe that when people get up close to it, they very quickly see how broken and harmful this system really is. So I know that we did not, so it seems like our chat did not work, but I'm going to, in just a second, put up on the screen um, an image with the link to our annual report, as well as our website and a QR for our donate page. Obviously, no obligation for any of that, but I do hope you'll consider going to the website and signing up for updates, as well as visiting the annual report and just spending a little bit of time with it and maybe using it to find that one fact that really sticks out to you and is something that maybe you would want to go tell your church group or your friend or your nephew. Um, I'm pulling it up right now.
I think that that's even a perfect example of just FADP's growth, because now we have webinars because we can have webinars. And so we're still figuring out how everything works. I think that also goes to Grace. We are all like, I am always looking for people to talk to about this and answer questions. And so please talk to us and, stay with us, and not just because we want you to do things, but because we learn so much from all of you, and get so much like hope. And if any of you have seen me on the vigils and seen Grace and Maria, and I mean, everything is because of you guys, all of it. Um, and so don't stop doing that. Just, being present and stuff like that. And obviously, if you can give and join and do all those things and follow us, that would be wonderful too. But mostly thank you for your presence. And yeah, just anything. We want to be here, not just as a resource, but, as really a community. And hopefully, we can instill that trust and you know, hope for a better Florida and a better US and a better, life for one person if it means buying them a stamp. Yeah.
Yeah, Bridget, to close, I'm hoping maybe we can both do this, but I think often it feels like last year was really grim. Could you just maybe, sorry, off the top of your head to put you on a spot, but what is something that happened last year that gave you hope?
Oh, I could, this is quite easy for me. I had the opportunity to drive over to a victim's family member's house, and I was terrified the entire time. I am a sociologist in my background, but I went through like all of the feelings of, am I on the wrong side? Am I doing something wrong? And this family embraced me in this like love and hope. And it was later in the year, and it I left, and I was like, everything else that happened this year, like this this was enough. And it I could see in their faces that us being there as a presence, and being willing to show up, not knowing exactly how they feel or how they would react or what they would ask for, was and continues to be one of the most incredible moments of my life, and a relationship that I will continue to treasure. And that's just one of, many moments, but that one definitely is up there.
And, something I love about that story is it's been such a meaningful relationship and also just a really cool example for me. That family now, they give a monthly gift to FADP in memory of the man who murdered their daughter. And I think that is, I think we could all do better to live by that example of radical forgiveness, which may not always feel accessible, but I think when it is, it can be really freeing. For me, mine is much more practical, I would say, but that I last year spent a lot of time in front of the legislature speaking about various bills, and it often felt like we didn't have any traction. But a Florida legislator actually went and witnessed an execution after hearing my testimony in a committee. And while he was not particularly vocal about it afterwards, I think that was a really positive sign that someone was willing to show up and actually go and see an execution, which is something that our governor has not done. Um, and so the more interest we can get from the people who make policy, the better that we are. And so that was a little bit of hope that things could change here in Florida. So thank you all so much for coming. And we are, like I said, info@fadp.org. We are always glad to speak with you about our work. And please follow along and join us this year. There will be a lot to do, but it is going to be really meaningful. And I believe that we'll turn the tide on this practice. So thank you for coming this evening.